and welcome. It is the old school, Dr. Stephen Bourgeois and Mr. Ross Miller, coming to you live from our various sanctum sanctorums inside our offices, surrounded by books, warm colors, and a general feeling of comfortability. Available on some of the places where you get your podcasts. We're still working on that. It's still an ongoing concern, but nevertheless, here we are. Good morning, Dr. Bourgeois.
Good morning, Mr. Miller, who just invented like two new words in that intro.
I did not. What are you talking about?
It said I can't even say it. Comfortability. What does that mean?
Comfortability, yes. The state of comfortableness.
What about comfort?
You can do that as well. You know, I tend not to go with the short words, but it depends upon where you are in your upbringing. But
that's okay. You're doing all the work.
Maybe I did make it up. I don't know. I have to look it up right now. So
I look up a lot of things when you talk.
What's the other word?
I forgot it now. I forgot a lot about your introduction. It was really good, though. I liked it.
Thank you.
So what are we doing today? What are we talking about here, Miller?
I thought we were just catching up on things, seeing how you're doing.
No, we don't do that. We get right to the
talk about personal problems and.
No. Keep on topic. We've had some reviews to our podcast, and they say that you meander a lot. Thank goodness that Bourgeois keeps us on track.
Well, every couple has got to have a dreamer, as Nate Bargatze once said, the comedian. Every couple's got to have a dreamer. You're the buzzkill, to keep us on track. Make sure we don't spend a lot of money. Don't take those exuberant vacations.
What was my original question? Oh yeah, what the heck are we doing, Mr. Miller?
Advice for new teachers.
That's it?
That's it.
That's your.
I think that's a pretty meaty topic, don't you think?
Well, the advice could be don't do it.
No, that's not going to be the advice.
Oh, well, for example, if you talk to a rabbi, you could tell me this story. Don't they try to dissuade you from converting initially? How does that work?
Well, there certainly is an exploration as to why you're doing it in the first place. I think the first warning sign or the first red flag for any rabbi who is counseling someone who wants to enter into the realm of Judaism willingly, or perhaps not, is if they're doing it for somebody else. Well, I married this lady and she's Jewish. And so, at that point, I think the rabbi starts getting all kind of warning signals, red alert signs, klaxons ringing off in the distance. And so, yes, I think I think the first question you got to ask yourself is, what are you doing it for? And I think that's a legitimate question. And it's a legitimate question that I'm not sure how many young teachers have the answer for. At least not in terms where they're not just spouting pablum, whatever kind of whatever they were told by their education school to say in interviews. I really want to make a difference. Oh, okay. You could create better road signs if you wanted to make a difference, So I think that's one of the things that I think every young teacher needs to be able to answer and do so without wading in the waters of whatever it is that education schools are dictating students to regurgitate at interviews.
Well, I think a lot of teachers go into it kicking and screaming. I know that was my stance. I didn't, wanted to do anything else than teach. My father was a teacher, and that was my idea through a lot of my college. And then it really became kind of a fallback, and I think that it's a pretty good fallback, but knowing you want to be a teacher, you really can't know until you have the experience. You think you might know.
Well, to a certain extent, you could say that about anything. I was actually quite excited to do it. Now, I found myself at times befuddled by what I was surrounded by. As far as like some of those early experiences in the classroom, like working as a university student, observing classes or what have you. But I always had the sense, from the moment I decided this is what I was going to go to school for, I always had the idea that I wanted to be a teacher, and I was kind of geeked up to do it. I liked it. I still like it.
It's good to know you've done it for like what, a quarter of a century. You're pretty old here, Miller.
Not as old
Oh,
as you though.
well, let's not get personal here.
Yeah.
Think back to the times, because I know there are some teachers in training out there, probably listening to us. I do recall that time, and you just mentioned it. Um, it's a little bit intimidating to take over a class. A lot of times you're sitting in the back watching, but then eventually you have to come out and stand in front of the class and interact. And so it's a big deal to do that. But I do remember some things kind of clicking, once I got to get in front of the class and interact with the students. And I found it stimulating. I really enjoyed that part. And I didn't even want to be a German teacher. That was my subject that I taught for 25 years. I was trying to go into music. And so I wanted to get certified in something that was the quickest certification happened to be German. Then my plan was to get into teaching music with that initial certification. But the weird thing is I found I enjoyed teaching German because of that interaction. Whereas in music, you're conducting a rehearsal, basically.
You'd say that the German was more kind of an interactive sphere in which you could work,
Yeah,
which you found more rewarding.
yeah. I like the back and forth kind of. There's so much humor in the way, at least the way you and I conduct a class, and it just it keeps things very interesting. And every, it's not by the book. Every class is different. So I noticed that pretty early on, but there's again a big jump between when you're training, because you're pretty much following the system of your cooperating teacher. You're not coming in with new ideas and let's try this. So you're pretty much what would you call it, imitating that teacher, but you're also processing and coming up with ideas. What do you recall early on? After maybe the transition from student teaching to actually having your own classroom.
Well, student teaching, I think, as far as like time of life or kind of phase of life that I happen to be in, I was a little bit different than my colleagues that were also doing student teaching. I spent 4.5 years in the military, and I was just in a different headspace, as the kids say, when I was doing it. And I was geeked up to do it. And I had a teacher, a cooperating, a teacher, overseeing teacher, who was willing to allow me to a certain extent, do my own thing. And we would talk it over every morning, what I was going to do or what my thought process was. But on the whole, I had a bit of a free hand. And then when it came time to be in my own classroom, it was more of an extension of that. But I think any good teacher will tell you there's a constant process of evaluation that is done. Where on the drive home, well, that didn't work, or hey, wow, that was pretty successful. That was fantastic. And so I think a combination of coming in with a certain amount of confidence. I think I already had that to a certain degree, but I think that reevaluation and willingness to try new things was something that I got from my supervisory teacher, and I kind of carried it into my own classroom.
I think it's amazing to consider how you change as a teacher. I mean, over 25 years, for example, that first experience, as a student teacher, I recall pretty much adopting his method, and this is for teaching German, so it's a little bit specific. But he got to school really early, about 90 minutes before the students would arrive, and he created a lot of worksheets. I mean, I had this and this stack of things. So he was the first in the copy room. That was different stacks for each class period, so it was pretty much paper based. He had one of the early grade book programs, and that was back in 1987. So I used that, in my first, several years of teaching, and I had like this Performa computer eventually. But it was all about having lots of grades and lots of worksheets and readings, but all prepared ahead of time. But the key word is prepared. And so these are things that I would create so I never in my career really took things off the shelf. And that was because for him, he said, this is the most creative part about teaching. You don't want to just do the same thing all the time. You want to constantly create new material. So I did take that away, but the worksheets, eventually I shifted from that. But I think you could generalize that people start with their student teaching experience and then morph after that.
They do. And I think one of the things that goes along with that, something that helped me as a teacher, as quickly as possible, a new teacher needs to start creating their own stuff. And I remember my first gig, I had a very supportive group of folks within the social studies department. Some of them I remained friends long after I left that school. And there was no expectation from me, and certainly nothing offered from them where they would just hand over, in total their stuff. Here's my stuff on this, or here's my stuff on that. It was all about saying, here's how you create your own stuff. And the creating of your own stuff was done for the purposes of allowing you the time to learn your craft, and not just learn your craft, but learn your subject. And so, anytime I see a new teacher come in and sometimes I'll have somebody say, we should give them all this stuff. I said, well, no. I think one of the problems of, one aspect of technology that can be problematic is that every textbook comes with it a whole test bank of questions. And so the person doesn't even have to write their own test questions. But the problem is there is a learning process and there is an enrichment process when you learn and write your own questions. And I would say that that's a tip I would give a kind of a new teacher. Yes, you want to start out with some things that perhaps you're getting from other people, because everybody knows a good teacher is in part a thief. You steal good ideas from other people and then you utilize them and you kind of modify them to your own circumstance. But I think it's also crucial that you start making up your own stuff as quickly as you can.
That could almost be a rule for good teaching. I kind of applied it to myself, or I would not give my students something to do unless I created it. It seemed kind of cheap to here I'm just printing out a worksheet that someone else created. It's got to be specific. I felt guilty if I just gave something off the shelf.
But there's always going to be times when something like that is going to be utilized. But at the same time, it's the question is, what are you doing to kind of improve your understanding of what it means to be a teacher, but also what it means to be a teacher of fill in the blank, whatever subject that you are endeavoring to teach. And so I think, the idea of creating your own material, it does not suggest that you can never use other people's material, but I think creating your own gives you a stake in that process.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the new teachers. I know you as in your current role, you hire new teachers, occasionally, and you've had some experiences, but also nationally, there's some kind of scary statistics within the first 5 years of teaching. 50% leave the profession entirely, which means that there are a lot of reasons to leave, and it could be that you want to do another profession and you're just tired of teaching. You want to perhaps start a family, and there are a lot of personal reasons. But still, after all of that training, suddenly you teach 1, 2, or 3 years and you're gone. Has that been your experience, over the years, seeing people, how many stick, I guess, after they start with a lot of confidence?
Well, I think when you look at the folks that I've hired, I've had a couple that burned out, and burned out in a sense that they simply were not prepared for the reality of the job in contrast to the theory of the job. And this is the problem with a lot of education schools at universities. They are ran by folks who have not been in a classroom in a real sense. Certainly not in a public school. I don't count university classrooms. It's a different animal. But these education programs are primarily ran by folks who they're hell and gone from their classroom experience. And so absent of relevant practical information that they can give, they have to fall back on theory. And the problem with theory is that it often doesn't hold with the reality. And so, you get teachers that, I mean, that's supposed to be what the student teaching experience is supposed to be about. Is the idea of getting a understanding of the reality of the situation. The problem is you're only doing it for about 2-3 months, as far as the university calendar jiving with the public school calendar. You're not doing it almost as far as an entire semester. And so your experience is limited. And so when you're thrown into the mix, that's where problems arise. Now, I've had teachers that I have worked with a great deal to kind of coach them along. And that makes it sound like that they didn't have their stuff together. That's not the case. But I think anybody thrown into a new situation is going to need some help to a certain extent. And so, mentoring or whatever the case may be, just a place where someone can ask questions, a mentor teacher that can anticipate problems that the teacher might have. We've been able to do that. And as a result, we've kept a lot of our new teachers, but we've lost a few. And it's because of that disconnect between how they learned their craft and then how they applied their craft.
I would think that there are things that never come up during student teaching, and they're kind of confronted once they have their own job. Mm. I don't know how many student teachers get to have a parent meeting when the parent is not happy. Maybe they're not even allowed to have that meeting.
Sure.
But that's an interaction that can make or break you. Interacting with a vice principal who may not know your content or a lot about teaching, but gives you some meaningful feedback that you don't agree with. That can happen. All of the testing and the fact that the tests are imposed upon a teacher, there's just a lot of stress and student discipline, managing disruptive behavior. I don't know if a student teacher these days gets to close the door and be alone with the students. I think that there are some rules that you're still in there. Is that correct?
Yes. Some teachers, different teachers, treat that differently, and so I think some do step away. And so I don't think it's against the rules that they're alone in the classroom with the students. Because I've seen it happen, but certainly it's not typical. I think a lot of times the overseeing teacher likes to kind of make sure that things are running smoothly. And if nothing else, that the student teacher hasn't screwed up something that they may have to fix later on, so right. That's a part of it as well. I was thinking about, I was laughing when you said parent teacher conference, because, you might recall, you were there for one of the worst ones I have ever had. It was the worst one I have ever had in my 25 years. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
I just recall the noise of this woman standing up while we were seated, and she was pounding on the table,
screaming.
Yeah, with emphasis, and she didn't seem to appreciate the moment. That she was surrounded by us, and I think our principal.
Yeah.
Right. And
our principal was a bit shocked, I think, by how that turned fairly quickly.
Yeah.
And there's nothing like the clarifying moment of being screamed at for like 10, 15 minutes. And then the screaming ends with the statement, "Answer me." And I started to laugh. And that's probably not a good strategy to use when you're confronted with an irate parent. But I didn't know what else to do. I didn't hear a question. And second, what could you say to step that parent off the ledge? I'm not quite sure it's possible. And as it turned out, it was not possible with her, but what are you going to do?
Well, we were kind of intrigued by how far it would go, but I think both of us, in retrospect, could have ended it much quicker and spared the principal that.
Or spared the teacher, by the way.
Yeah, well, that's true.
But yes, I think we were curious about how long her rant would last. She could have her own talk show,
We should have her as a guest. We could do that. But that's something that that you don't experience it in student teaching, and
right.
When you do, you're never ready for it. And I guess in my own student teaching, the teacher did go to another room. It was a split level class, third and fourth year German. So I was with the third year, so I had my own class for really the whole semester. So that was kind of unique.
Right.
But dealing with, disruptive student behavior in your class, and I mean, in the halls, I mean, how many student teachers break up a fight, you know? It's something that will get your attention because that's part of the job, and you're in the hallway and you're dealing with students who aren't yours, and you have to have confrontations quite often,
Right.
but that's not in the manual, right, as they're preparing to be a teacher.
So what do we do then as advice? How do we frame advice for the young teacher who admittedly is coming into the classroom with not as much real world experience as they perhaps should have? We talked about the difference there in Germany, where in Germany there's an extensive practicum period before they have their own classroom. So what kind of things would you bring up?
Well, I think I said at the beginning that they should just not do it. Don't go into the profession.
Well, that's a ridiculous piece of advice.
Well, I thought it was.
Let's assume that people listening want to be teachers.
Well, I'm trying to talk them out of it to spare them all the sorrow later. But it sounds a little pithy. We've said before, don't go to the faculty room because they'll turn you against the profession. But I think the biggest worry is isolation. You're in a room with students of whatever age, most of the day. So being able to talk to other teachers is really important, but to be honest, because, if you talk to a school administrator, I mean, they're supposed to be your coach, right? On, like managing student behavior.
Correct.
But they're also evaluating you. And so there's that, you need a safe space to vent, to get upset, but also to get some real answers. And I think that's the most important. A lot of little things of just having a job and being professional come in. A lot of new teachers don't really know how much work it's going to be. So I would expect during the first year that you're getting to school early and staying late. It's just the way it is, and eventually you find your way. But having that mentor would be helpful. I think you had a mentor at various times, didn't you?
I did. Now, when I first started, though, I was very reticent to speak because unfortunately, like other professions, there is a political sphere to the relationships within a school. And there are people that you can talk to, and there are people that perhaps you should not talk to. And not even the question about administrators where you're talking to potentially someone who's going to be evaluating you, but just to be cautious about who you speak with regarding whatever issues you're dealing with. But I think once you find that person, you've got to lean on that individual, and that individual understands because that individual's been there themselves, But to be able to find that individual, to be able to talk with, and to be able to vent is key.
Well, there are individual students, that are difficult to deal with, and so sometimes your day can be made or not made by, is that student even in attendance? And the feeling, oh, good, that student's not here now. I can teach. It's relaxed.
Right.
But the whole thing can shift because of that. And so a new teacher needs to find a way to, to get through to that student. And, it can be a confrontation, it can be a private conversation, but there are some hurdles, and individual students can be hurdles, but an experienced teacher can get past that. So you're not just sending them to the office or writing referrals, because that's not sustainable, and it's really not a solution. It works against teachers for the most part, and at least from the administrative perspective, they want you to be able to solve that problem without using them.
Right. I think the other thing, I think an additional thing would be for teachers to read. In the schools of education, they will have a litany of books that you are required to read. And most of them, from my personal experience and from what I know talking to new teachers, a lot of the books are recently published. by the more modern day picadillos of the profession.
No
I
one's
think there's
used that
something.
word picadillo in like 20 years or so.
But I think there's something to the idea of going back. When you look at the opening salvo, the opening writing that you so cleverly wrote regarding our podcast, you evoked the words of Neil Postman, and I think that someone like him or someone similar to him is not a bad idea to read, because I think when you look at the books of that are being recommended in education schools, I think a lot of it represents current and ultimately very transient ideas. And what you need is something a little bit more grounding as a new teacher. And so I think it's imperative to read uh, what those who came before you have said on the matter. And I'm not talking about just going back to Neil Postman in the mid 60s. I'm talking about going back to what did education mean during the Enlightenment? What did education mean during the classical period? Because you can't tell me there's not an application there. But if you think that all that is to be known and all that is to be learned is being written over the course of the last couple of years, well, that's just idiotic. And you have to have a broader sense of your profession, and reading what others have written on the subject, I think, would be paramount.
Well, and at the very beginning of our conversation, we talked about the why. Why are you teaching to begin
Mhm.
with? And it has to be more than a paycheck, because the paycheck just isn't that great. But there is a rhythm to the year, and I guess this is my counsel to a new teacher, is that it's a kind of a long, it's a marathon that year, and there are highs and lows, and you tend to have some elation early on in the year, and then you, after a couple of months, things kind of bog down a little bit, and then you're waiting for that vacation that you get through it. And then the spring starts and you're into testing, but there are about 3 or 4 lows and a lot of highs in between there. And eventually, I mean, right now you're in the midst of it this time of the school year, but there's going to come that time where the school year gets kind of silly because it's over,
Right.
and it always surprises us every year, right? Oh yeah, wait a minute, I've done this 25 times,
Yes.
and by May it's done. And so
Yeah.
I guess the new teachers need to know that it does have kind of this denouement, right?
Yes.
And it's at the end of the school year, and then the summer they rejuvenate and they come back and repeat it. But there eventually, that schedule and the regularity of all those emotions and the calendar is really comforting. You have
Yeah.
the weekly calendar, you have the vacations and the summer, and it becomes part of your life.
Now they often, if I may evoke baseball.
No,
No, yeah, well, there's a connection here. Stick
thought that
with
was
me
a
for a
question,
second.
like a
No, no,
request.
no, no. I was more. It's more of a statement actually than a request. But they often talk about baseball during June and July, and August is the dog days of summer, because that is the grinding period of the baseball season. And a school year has its own dog days, and you know the joy and the energy of August, the capriciousness and just ridiculousness of May is sandwiches a period of time that, as you say, has those highs and lows, and to be able to navigate those lows, I think is essential for any new teacher to be able to, as you say, to find the comfort in it, um, is essential to a new teacher.
Right. And as a student teacher, you mentioned that the university schedule doesn't necessarily allow a full semester, usually.
Right.
I mean, not in real life. And a lot of times the student teacher is on the sidelines kind of taking things in, and eventually they get their time, but they really don't get to appreciate that, the changes, the seasonal aspect of teaching. And
Hmm.
I think also early on, I don't know how many teachers leave during the first semester. I'd like to read some statistics, but it is exhausting, and you build
Hmm.
up endurance. And for one thing, speaking out loud, using your indoor voice, but a pretty full indoor voice, takes some endurance, and your voice wears out, and just it takes a toll on you. but then eventually you get your sea legs and you can do it, and you start to look forward to, I guess, that challenge.
Well, you talk about the physical demands. That's something that I had a bit of a head start on because my father um, was a minister. Once we converted from Judaism to Christianity, my father got into the ministry,
Hmm.
and he suffered from throat cancer after about 5-6 years of preaching. And so, and when I started my career, it was something that he always counseled me on, was the idea of how you take care of your voice. Because as you say, that end of August, you're getting sore throats, just because you're projecting your voice in a way that you've not done in, say, 2.5 months. And so the demands of being on your feet, the demands of being up and down, working with students, if you're an elementary teacher, good gracious, can you imagine the physical demands of an elementary school teacher in contrast to a high school teacher? But yes, I think physically you have to be aware that there are going to be demands on your body that you've not experienced yet. The idea of going down to something as pedestrian as good shoes. I mean, there's a lot of things that a teacher has to think about from a physical point of view at the start of the year.
Well, and the teacher does control the schedule within that classroom of activities. And if it's an activity where you're leading class, actively speaking, and I mean, this happened to me quite often. Oh my goodness, I spoke all day today, nonstop. And I think the better approach is to do that, occasionally, but mix in other activities. And so it's
Right.
something that you can get through without wearing yourself out, because I think that's the most exhausting. But the truth is, whenever and I'm talking about high school now, when you're in a room with high school students, it's exhausting by nature.
Right.
They could be talking or reading or doing worksheets, whatever it is. They're taking energy from you, and kind of sucking it away, gone forever. But that's the nature of it as well. So you don't really get away unscathed no matter what you do in that room.
And if you're like me, I mean, I think by nature I'm an introvert. And I have become, as a product of this job, kind of what I refer to as a situational extrovert, where, I have to kind of build myself up a bit to be in front of the classroom vocally, energetically. I'm just not that bombastic as I might be, say, in front of a class. So I think having an understanding of what you're like naturally, and the degree to which you can translate that in the classroom, I think is essential. Yeah. So.
Well, that can be really joyful, because I think you're right. I mean, we're both introverts, deeply introverted in some ways. But there's something about, when the lights come on and you're not on the stage, but kind of like that in a classroom, it does work, and it clicked for me as well. And I don't know what it is, but you're around kids for one, so you have, there's a different dynamic than if you were around a group of parents talking to them. Usually that's not fun for anybody. But that's, I guess, we could call those words of wisdom for a new teacher who's a little bit afraid of stepping in. You'll know it when you hit that moment and start to enjoy it and look forward to it.
Right. And that persona that you carry with you into the classroom, you have to have that with students. You have to have that with the aforementioned parents. You have to have that with administrators, but there's that. Now, I imagine that our podcast will, over the course of time, include various bits of advice for not just young teachers, but teachers in general. I want to leave you, though, with an idea that's more specific to my discipline. And that is the idea of the teaching of critical thinking. And Christopher Hitchens, famed atheist and intellectual, once said that that critical thinking is not a product of what you think, it's how you think. Now, from a historical point of view, there are plenty of people willing to take the bully pulpit and pontificate. And I am not here to disparage those who do that, although I will say that there is a potential problem there. When you talk about your own political viewpoints, or you talk about your own viewpoints on anything, really, that the part of the purpose of particularly a social studies teacher, is to allow the kids to develop their own ideas, and they cannot do it if they're trying to mimic yours. They've got plenty of people to tell them what they should think. The key is, how do you teach a kid to think on their own? And it's not an easy task, and it is a frustrating task for them. As a teacher, it doesn't matter what you think. I think part of your role is to be the devil's advocate. Whatever they spit out, from whatever segment of the spectrum they happen to be on, you have to be able to combat that idea. You know, it's one thing to have an opinion. For God's sakes, be able to talk about it and defend it. You know, don't be just another person mimicking what someone else said and confuse that with intellectualism or deep thought. It's actually the opposite. And so I think from a kind of a beginning standpoint for a history teacher, I think that's key. You know, that you always hear stories about history teachers that are quite willing to use their classroom to advocate one questionable idea after another. And I think that any history teacher who thinks that's part of their job, I think you have a gross misunderstanding of the job. You know, and so for especially new history teachers, and I guess this goes for any teacher, because God knows there's plenty of people willing to spout off about what they think, as we're doing on this podcast. But, you know, in front of a classroom, you have a much more you have a much more impressionable audience. And to that end, you have to be careful about what you say.
But also being open to that conversation, which
exactly
can get quite messy. You know, the danger of teaching is that you worry so much about what the perception of a controlled classroom. So if an administrator walks in, that everybody's doing what they should be doing, the objectives are on the board, and it's kind of this linear process. But what you just described is really messy. I mean, critical thinking is just that, critical. And so if you have a classroom where students can hypothesize, can say silly things maybe, but just they're testing it out, testing the waters, and you're a safe place. But also you provide some guidance when they get a little off track. But that's messy, you know. And so I would say that the better teachers are not afraid of that. You know, that they don't want that to permeate every minute of class, but they kind of enjoy that messiness of the interaction with the students.
And, you know, unfortunately, the current atmosphere does not really allow for a teacher to easily wade into those waters. That makes it all the more important to do so. You know, the idea of, for example, we'll end here with a kind of an example. My first year at a particular school. I used to teach AP government. And so one of the things I would do is I would assign students Supreme Court cases that frequently made its appearance on the AP exam. And so what they would do is they'd have to sit there and they would have to study the case. What was the constitutional question behind the case? How did the court rule? Why did the court rule that way? Consequences of the case, yada, yada, yada. Okay. And so one of the cases that I had, and again, I was first year teacher at this school. One of the first cases I had was a sodomy case that was Lawrence versus Texas. And so I had a kid and I said, do you mind if I assign you this case? Are you okay? Are you comfortable with this? And the kid said, fine. Yes, no problem. I said, okay, very good. So you do this case, because that's a case that's shown up on the test, and that, you're smirking because you see where this is going. And
I'm trying to hold back my laughter.
But the thing is that the mother found out what the kid was researching.
No, that wasn't the mother who pounded on the table.
No. That's a different pounding on the table. But she found out what her son was researching. She called the principal and she called the vice principal. She called everybody, strangely enough, but me, to try to put a stop to this. And so I remember being called into the office, and then one of the vice principals said that we've had a complaint from a teacher that you're teaching sodomy. I said, can we assume as a basis of this discussion that I wasn't teaching sodomy? Can we go ahead and work under that assumption? And we can go ahead and just set that aside and then go ahead and deal with the rest of this ridiculous conversation, And so it was so comical. It would have been comical if I were not in a room with a couple of vice principals answering the charge that I'm teaching sodomy. So, the idea that this is some of the things that you run into when you endeavor to give your students a chance to think things through that perhaps maybe they ordinarily would not have thought through, and the idea that, Texas versus Johnson versus Texas is an instrumental case as far as gay rights in this country, and as far as the kind of laws that are allowed at the state level. It's an important case. And if I can't sit there and talk to seniors about something of this importance without some yahoo saying I'm teaching sodomy, I can see why teachers are reticent to enter into that fray. But I think it makes it all the more important that you're willing to do it. And I didn't apologize. I didn't apologize to the lady. I said, and there was a demand for an apology. I said, in addition to assuming that I wasn't teaching sodomy, we can go ahead and assume I'm not going to apologize, because this is part of my job, for God's sakes, So it does have its risk, but given that it seems like most people talking about politics aren't really thinking at all, and they're certainly not, because no thinking human being is dogmatic. Okay. So everybody who talks in dogmatic terms, and I guess I am now, I guess, but
I was going to suggest that, but I was enjoying the irony of this.
But I think anybody who speaks about political or social issues in dogmatic terms, it's almost guaranteed they're not thinking through things. And this goes to how you teach students how to think.
Well, we might have a complete show on controversial issues that come up teaching.
Sure.
And I know that, over the years, the things that we could get into 20 years ago, we would be walking on eggshells now, bringing it up. And it's probably safer often not to, but I enjoyed the story. But the listener, or I'd like to know how it resolved. Did the student have to recite the facts of the case?
I believe the student was transferred.
Transferred out of the school?
It's been some time now since it happened, but I believe it was transferred out. Yes. And it was not the student's decision, because the student came up to me later and said, "Mr. Miller, you need to know that wasn't me." And I said, "Hey, whatever, I'm not going to badmouth his parents, in front of him, even though I had plenty to say about their parents." But I think the kid was transferred out of the class.
So directly related to an assignment that you gave and that conversation, the student left right. The school and
not left the school, but left my class. And
well, you said transfer. I thought they left the state or something.
I'm done with Texas. They're teaching sodomy, for God's sakes.
I should have never moved here.
I thought the Mexican food would keep me here, but no, I'm not standing for this. But the other thing was that the principal said, because I told him, I said, "Listen, I was teaching a AP class, and I was also teaching on-level classes, and the vice principal actually said, there's certain things you do in AP classes, but you shouldn't do in regular classes." I said, "Well, that's a whole other discussion right there, and certainly it can be another discussion here." I hope that vice principal has become aware of the fallacy of that argument, but yes, I think he was actually transferred to another class.
Okay. I was thinking that the vice principal was transferred as well.
Well, they probably should have been as well. That was a pretty dumb comment, as well as opening the meeting with, "We're told you're teaching sodomy," and that was a first for me. And it was so asinine. I didn't know how to react at first, but.
I don't know if you've ever told me that story before. So it was a good one. Well, I think we're wrapping things up, or things will deteriorate at this point.
It can only go downhill from here. So
yeah,
I'm still hoping that the Germans are listening to more than 2.5% of the podcast. I'm hoping for 3% next week, just a little bit, bit more.
Those statistics are troubling, but we're going to carry on.
We are going to carry on.
So. Well, I think we close with your story, but we want new teachers to have a little bit of hope.
Yes.
I tended to pick apart a lot of just deconstruct that first year. A little bit of a pessimistic attitude on my part, and I'd like to apologize for that. But I do get in those moods. But overall, wouldn't you say that the rewards of teaching you can't really quantify?
Indeed. And, nothing worth doing is not without its travails, and so I certainly would not be afraid of the travails that are associated with teaching, simply because, as you say, the benefits and rewards are not only numerous, but difficult to measure. So,
well, very good. And I hope talking to us or hearing from us is not like going into a faculty room. That would be terrible.
Indeed.
Well, sir, let's call it a wrap. Let's wrap this, or whatever the technical term is for that.
Okay. Well, so long, Herr Dr. Bourgeois.
And so long, Herr Miller.